Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. I am so excited about my guest this week, and I know you, all my listeners hear me say that often, but truly, John and I had tried to interview this. I tried to have this interview a couple of weeks ago. Things went awry, so I've been anxiously anticipating and awaiting this interview. And so this is a little bit of a lengthy bio, but I really want to read John's entire bio because he has such an interesting journey of what has brought him to this place in time. So this is going to be a real treat. So go grab some coffee and enjoy this interview today. So John Roedel is a comic who unexpectedly gained notability as a writer and poet through his heartfelt Facebook conversations that went viral and became an Amazon best-selling book titled Hey God, Hey John. He is the author of 5 books. The first I just noted. The second book is Any Given Someday, Untied, the poetry of what comes next, Remedy, and his latest book, Upon Departure, which explores through poetry the concept of our grief as a natural wonder, what terraforms the landscape of our world in increments, offering a sincere and very relatable look at his faith crisis, mental health, personal struggles, perception of our world, and even his fashion sense. John's writing has been shared millions of times across social media and lauded by fans and readers worldwide. He teaches at universities and retreat centers across the US, blending his trademark comedy with creative exercises, journaling, dialogue, and introspection to help people fearlessly embrace and share their personal stories. And of course, my readers know too, it's near and dear to my heart, using writing as a medium to work through really hard emotion. And so, John, with that intro, I would love for you to set the tone today with one of your poems, if you would. And welcome to the show.
Oh, it is my absolute honor to be here. And just talking to you real briefly beforehand, I just love your energy. So I'm so excited. Okay.
Ditto, me too. Okay, go ahead and read.
My brain and heart divorced a decade ago over who is to blame about how big of a mess I've become. Eventually, they couldn't be in the same room with each other. And now my head and heart share custody of me. I stay with my brain during the week, and my heart gets me on weekends, but they never really speak to one another. Instead, they just give me the same note to pass to the other one every week. And the notes they pass between each other, well, they always say the same thing. They say, "This is all your fault." On Sundays, my heart complains about all the ways my head has let me down in the past. And on Wednesdays, my head lists all the times that my heart has screwed things up for me in the future. They blame each other for the state of my life. And there's been a lot of yelling and crying. So lately, I've been spending a lot more time with my gut, who kind of serves as my unofficial therapist. Most nights, I sneak out of the window in my rib cage and I slide down my spine and I plop myself down on my gut's plush leather couch that's always open for me. And I just sit until the sun comes up. But last evening, my gut asked me if I was having a hard time being caught between my head and my heart. I nodded. I said, I didn't know if I could live with either of them anymore. I said, my heart is always sad about something that happened yesterday, while my head is always worried about something that might happen tomorrow. My gut just squeezed my hand, but I continued. I said, I just can't live with my mistakes of the past or my anxieties about the future. My gut smiled and said, in that case, I think you should go stay with your lungs for a while. And I was confused, and the look on my face gave it away. But my gut said, if you're exhausted about your heart's obsession with the fixed past and your mind's focus on an uncertain future, then your lungs are the perfect place for you. There's no yesterday in your lungs. There's no tomorrow there either. There's only now. There's only inhale. There's only exhale. There is only this moment, and there is only breath. And in that breath, you can rest for a little while your head and your heart work out their relationship. So this morning, while my brain was busy reading tea leaves and while my heart was staring at old photographs, I packed up a little bag and I walked down to the door in my lungs. And before I could even knock, she opened the door and with a smile and as a gust of wind embraced me, she said, "What took you so long?"
Wow, that is just beautiful.
As everything, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, I wrote that in the middle of a panic attack. I write from a place where I'm feeling things. I don't think of it as an autopsy. I'm looking back like a day or two later to something I experienced. Normally, when I'm overtaken by something, which happens more often than not, I immediately try to stop everything and write about it so I can capture how I feel in that moment. It's like a dream journal. You know, they tell you, oh, you should keep a dream journal next to your bed so when you wake up in the night, you can write it while it's still fresh. That's what emotions are. When I feel this real strong tug on my heart, I stop everything I'm doing. I try to, unless I'm operating a car with children in it, and I sit down and I write it so I can capture exactly how I felt. And I wrote that poem at about 25, 30 minutes. I had to pick up my wife from work. This was about a year and a half ago. And I knew I only had like 30 minutes to get out what was ever stuck inside of me. And I kind of poured that out in about 30 minutes. And I don't do yoga. I'm shaped like a penguin, so yoga is tricky for me to do. But this piece, I've they love yogis and mindful people and people who do breath work love it because it talks about staying in your lungs, staying in your breath, and that was exactly the message I needed to write for myself in that moment.
It's so beautiful and profound on so many levels. And I think that, there's so much research out there around the therapeutic benefits of writing. But what I love that writing does is it moves it and it gets it out of our head because that's where
Yep.
things spin. Things can spin on our head over and over and over again. And when we can get it out, people do this lots of ways, right? Either through music or art or
Yep.
writing or exercise or move, right? I say move it, people, just move it.
Right.
But I but
Right.
I really want to take a step back because I did have some time to talk to you prior to recording and want to start at sort of backing up at the beginning of your story. There's a line that I wrote here that grabbed me. My heart gets me on weekends. And I love that because I think so often we're on this hamster wheel in our week and we're going and we're going and we're doing all of the things. And then we have a minute to breathe on the weekend if we give ourselves that. And all of a sudden it can feel like we're slamming up against a door and being like, what am I doing? You're checking in with yourself. Maybe you're not happy. Maybe you're depressed. I don't really know. But I think that what I love about your story is somehow you found your gut, you found your heart, and it leads your way now. I believe
Yeah.
from what I heard is in the driver's seat now. So can you bring us to that time before you discovered the writing? Tell us your story about your son.
Yeah, no, I my experience with writing before anyone who ever taught me English, any person who ever had the misfortune of educating me as a young person, the idea that I can even write a sentence or poetry would stun them. I didn't study poetry growing up. I wasn't a big reader. Academics were never my thing. The lunchroom was all I was all about going to school just for the lunchroom because it was a captive audience where I could try to make people spit milk out through their nose or do things like that. That was kind of why I went to school. My dad was a pharmacist. His dad's dad was a pharmacist. His dad's dad was a pharmacist. And we had a store here, and I live in Cheyenne, Wyoming, that they built. We founded a store here in town in the 1880s, like when it was an old west. Before Wyoming was even a state, we had a pharmacy here in town. So my dad was kind of a serious scientist. My mom was a single room schoolhouse teacher with a ruler, very, very interested in academics and jumping through those hoops. My older brother, I have one brother. He's an electrical engineer for Xbox. He is very analytical. I was born kind of like a little alien child to these poor three people that had to kind of work with me. And so I always wanted to just make people laugh and do those kind of things. And when I was in college, I was only going to college just to make my parents happy. I was like, I'll get my degree and then I will go off and do my own thing. I'm just doing this to check this box off. But I was a junior in college and I thought, well, I got to get out of here. This is not for me. I was barely scraping by. The idea of studying historical facts from the 1700s when I could now look it up on the internet it seemed ridiculous to me. So I was really struggling with academics in general. And so I was calling my dad. He was at work. I practiced a speech of telling him I was going to be dropping out of college and moving to Chicago so I could join Second City Comedy, which was like the minor leagues of like Saturday Night Live. I was going to go and just wait tables and do this crazy thing. I was like 21 at the time. I was like, this is the perfect time to go do that. And I remember I called my dad on the phone. I'd practiced a speech. I was so nervous. And before I could even tell him what was going on with me, he told me, he's like, I need you to come. I was in Laramie, Wyoming, which is about 50 miles away from my parents. They told me I needed to come back to Cheyenne because my dad had lung cancer. And it was pretty serious. And he needed me to come back to help take care of my mom because they had me later in life. So they were both pretty old, and to help run the store that have been in our family for years.
So
And
you
so,
had so you had this big dream. Here you were,
yeah,
21, and you were
yeah,
geared up to tell your dad that you were gonna follow your heart. Let's go back
yeah,
to following the
right,
heart.
yes, yeah,
And now you have to return home due to this
yeah. And to my
tragic
parents' credit,
news.
it wasn't like, oh, you have to do this, but I mean, it just felt like, and in my mind, like, oh, this will be temporary. I'll come back and help for a while. He'll get better, and then I'll still be able to pick up on this journey. That was in 1996. And fast forward a little spoiler alert, I'm still in Cheyenne, Wyoming in 2022. So when I came back, you know, I left college, I came back, I started running our family store. I worked at a church to help kind of supplement all that. And I kind of had a life where I was living for my parents, helping them out, helping my dad, who eventually died about a year later. The lung cancer was very advanced and moved very quickly. And so that was my first experience with loss. And I remember struggling. I had never had someone I loved or saw every day in my life or had such a personal relationship who is now gone. Like just not physically there anymore. The idea of wrapping my head around that was very difficult for me. And my mom
And
at
you
that
were still quite young. You were what, 22, 23 years old?
22 at this point, yeah.
Yeah.
And a cradle Catholic. I had been born and raised Catholic, and I was even working at a Catholic church, like I mentioned at this point. And I was really struggling with all of the faith ideas that were being told, oh, if you just pray, it's going to be fine. You're going to feel better about this. And it wasn't helping me. And that's when I first started just writing for myself, just real briefly, writing some things, little notes for myself about my dad so I could remember. That was the first time I remember sitting down, ever writing anything that wasn't I was writing for class or writing for somebody else. I was writing for myself. And I remember doing that for the few months after that. And it helped me through it. And then, so I was in town. My wife and I had met in high school or junior high, and we started dating in high school. And so we got married when I was 23. At this point, I realized, okay, I'm going to be in Cheyenne a little bit longer than I had planned on. So we might as well get married now and start. We knew we wanted to get married, start our lives now. We don't have to wait. And so about the year 2000, we had our firstborn son, Noah. And I didn't have any younger children, wasn't around children very much growing up. So when Noah was born, I thought, very typical baby. This is what all babies do. He cried a lot, very sensitive. By about the time we were 2, I remember we went to a reunion of people in college, and everyone kind of had starting kids at the same time. And Noah was 2, and all their, my friends' kids were 2, and he was running around with the other kids. And we saw he was so radically different than any other kid of any peer his age. Just the things I remember, he ran through a thorn bush. Like everyone was kind of playing hide and seek. He ran through this thorn bush with 500 scratches, open wounds all over his body, and it didn't faze him. It didn't make him cry. My experience of pain is I get a sliver, I need to go seek ER treatment immediately, and I need a morphine drip. He was like hurt. And then it brought me back to like a couple months earlier. He ran outside in the snow and ran on his feet were almost like they were frostbitten. Like we caught by the time we got, and like it didn't bother him at all. And these things started clicking in our head where something was going on beyond our understanding. He was our first kid. Had he been our third child, we had 2 more children since then. We would have maybe picked up on these signs, but we didn't right away. And so eventually we took him down to Denver because in Cheyenne, where I live, there wasn't a lot of research for pediatric for developmental issues at that time. And we took him down to Denver. And I remember we had kind of already prepared for this diagnosis, but we were in this office and they told us, your son is autistic. He's going to be living with autism. And he's, you need to start preparing yourself for a life in which he will never be in a mainstream classroom. Because he was nonverbal at this point. He only spoke to us kind of with his shrieks and screamings. He had been speaking for a while and all of a sudden it just disappeared. And he had kind of fallen into himself and gone mostly mute, except for the yelling. And they told us he will never live independently. He'll never have you need to prepare. He will never have things like you took for granted, a first kiss. He will never go to prom. He will never live independently. He will probably never have a job. The idea of him having a family or anything like that, you need to start understanding that his life is going to be radically different than you think you've ever prepared for.
And John, remind us, I'm sorry, how old was
Yeah.
he at diagnosis?
About 2.5.
Two and a half, yeah.
Yeah, this is the year 2000. So about 2.5, a little bit older. And so we're driving back from Denver, Colorado, which is about an hour and a half from my home. And I remember he's in the back seat, in the car seat, and it was an all day, it was like a 12-hour battery of tests. And we're driving home, and my wife is driving because if she were here, she would tell you that's the safest thing possible for my wife to drive and me to sit shotgun and navigate the music. And so, but we're driving home and we're in silence, kind of absorbing everything. And I'm still 45 miles behind us in Denver, still in that doctor's office, still hearing the humming of the fluorescent lights. I can still picture everything about that moment, even though we had kind of prepared ourselves for a diagnosis that we wouldn't like. I was stuck in that moment. My wife in that was not where I was. She was already, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to call these people. And if that doesn't work, we're going to call this person. And then we're going to do this. And that became her MO for the entire thing. It's like, we're going to try everything. Like, no matter how radical it is. And back in the year 2002, the idea of autism, I mean, Rain Man was the only reference point we had for autism at that point. And the community we grew up, there wasn't any specialists or really anything. Speech therapy was just starting to come on around here. And it was the idea that, she's like, we might have to move. We might have to do all these things. And it was her first example of teaching me what improv is, which became a big part of my life later on. And the core concept of improv is you say yes to whatever is suggested, whatever is in front of you, you just say yes to it. And after that, you say and. So yes, this is happening, and here's where we go. And it was my first lesson in improv because she said, yes, and we're going to call this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. Where I wasn't there, I was stuck in grief. And I was stuck there for at least 3 years. And I missed those first 3 years because here I was with my child who would be sitting on my lap or in the car seat behind me or running around in front of me live, very vibrant, very energetic, but I'm grieving everything that I thought him and I would share together. I'm grieving the fact that he might not ever perform in a sport. These stupid things. I'm not an athlete, but the idea of like all these things that I thought would happen, now I'm never going to see him do. He might not ever graduate from high school. He might not ever have a job. He might not ever call me and tell me, oh, I met this wonderful girl at a party last night. All these imaginary things in my head that I had been given the script for what a dad was going to be like, I no longer had. And I was grieving him while he was sitting in front of me.
And I
for
think
about 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and I want to pause here. I feel like this is such an important point that you're making, because for listeners who have been listening to this podcast for a while, might remember Dr. Boss, who talks about ambiguous loss. And ambiguous loss is when the person is still alive, but you're grieving what you can't have or what has been lost. I worked in brain injury for a long time and saw this deep grief. And that, John and I, you and I were talking about how do you hold the joy that you've got this beautiful son and the pain and the grief of what is never going to come, imagined or otherwise. Let's face it, parents hold dreams for their children, right? I mean, you just do. We wouldn't be human if we didn't. And so your wife went into, with the news, she went into action mode and you went into screech mode, both both are certainly normal and reasonable when you
Yep.
get tragic news.
Yep.
And it was tragic news. It was tragic because now you've got a different situation that you're dealing with, and you have no idea what this is going to look like for him.
Right. Right.
And
There's
the
no
doctors
roadmap.
don't, right,
Yeah.
there's no roadmap, and the doctors don't know either. I mean, they only have their cases that
Yep.
they've worked on, but who knows what that's going to be like for your son, Noah.
Yep.
So, all right, so you're in grief for 3 years. Your wife is in action mode.
Right.
Did you start writing during this time?
Yeah. So I kind of used what I was talking, like when I wrote when my father had passed. This was a completely different, and I didn't know I was grieving. It's really amazing how you write about that. I didn't know it was grief. I thought of it, a lot of it was guilt. What did I do? What have I done to have caused this? What lifestyle choice, what in my DNA, whatever, all these things that you start thinking about, what role do I have in this? Why didn't we notice sooner? All these things, these self-inflicted wounds that I couldn't change. There was nothing I could do to change with it, but I was stuck in that yesterday of guilt. And then we had to bump into the idea. So I had my own expectations of what our family life was going to look like. And then you bump into other people's expectations of what your family should look like. Extended family who, told us you cannot tell anybody about his diagnosis because it will be a shame and a mark against the family. It is this old school way of thinking that, of course, now seems so like prehistoric. But back then, I mean, I had multiple conversations with well-intended angels who were like, just don't tell anyone. Don't ever tell him, let alone don't tell anyone in his class. Thank God for my wife, who was like, it doesn't matter. Like all that, it's action. And we're going to be desperate to make this connection. And so my way of connecting was, in order to stay sane, was I would write these little observations I would make about autism. And a lot of them had to do with, and I didn't know it at the time, he was so living in the moment. I mean, he didn't worry about getting hurt yesterday. I mean, he broke his arm at 4 years old, and he emotionally recovered from that within like an hour, had his arm set, everything go, and then he was back to normal, like as normal as he could be. He lived in the moment, was the tabernacle of his life. Like that's where he lived. And I would start writing these little observations, even if they were like 3 or 4 sentences at a time, saying, autism is terrifying. It's a map where we don't know where we're going. And we lived in a place, and at the time, where a lot of more research has been done about autism over the last 20 years. In 2002, we were still that flower was still blossoming. So we didn't have any idea of where this road was going, but it caused our family to grow tighter together. We knew we had to support one another, and my wife supported my process. I definitely supported my wife when she's like, we're going to try hippotherapy, which was horseback riding, which I thought at the time in 2004, was like, how is that going to help? That doesn't make any sense. We're going to try music therapy. We're going to try Reiki. We're going to try anything we can. We're going to put our egos aside and just throw everything on the wall. And so that was her process. My process was writing, and it kept me sane, and it kept me looking at things with perspective from a distance, almost from like a satellite looking down. So I wasn't in the moment. I was watching it, observing it, and it helped me out quite a bit. And I didn't know it was helping me out, but until later on in life. So that experience through his, and from then, about a year later, after his diagnosis, I started getting involved in improv. Although I never could go to Second City, I didn't do my Saturday Night Live, but all of a sudden I started learning about improv, which is getting on stage and getting a suggestion from the audience and then building an entire scene around that. It's chaotic, it's wild, it's messy, it often fails, but that's part of the fun of it. And that was, I think it was because we were living yes and that philosophy is, yes, this is happening and here we go. Let go of all expectations you have. On stage, if I have this great idea, oh, this is going to be super funny, I really want to do this, and all of a sudden the suggestion is, oh no, you're the Pope on the moon milking a cow, I've got to let go of all these preconceived notions of what I thought I was going to do that was funny, and all of a sudden become the best Pope milking a cow without gravity anyone's ever seen before. And it's letting go of of your expectation and your script, and just saying yes, and here we go. And that was, I kind of started, and I unintentionally started using those lessons I learned from my first breaths of parenthood, and I started doing it on stage in front of people. And then I started writing. We started writing these. I kind of found a group of people that wanted to do this with me here in Cheyenne, which is a small community. It was not a, what would you say, a dynamic comedic scene here in town. But I found some other people that would go on this journey with me. And then in that, I started writing comedy sketches. So we would do improv, but then I'd also write little 5 to 8 minute little scenes like you would see on Saturday Night Live. And so I didn't make it to Chicago. I didn't make it to Saturday Night Live, but we created one here in town that went on for about 13 or 14 years. And in
Wow.
that, I would write all the time. I probably wrote about 150, 200 of these little sketches that were all about making people laugh and transporting them for maybe what's going on in their life and giving them like an hour and a half respite from what was going on, because that was writing for me was a respite for me. And I found a way, but maybe it can also be a respite for other people. And so that was my first experience with writing for other people. And the shows went really well and they did really well. And it helped me become a disciplined writer early on.
Well, I'm still back. When you're still back in the doctor's office, I'm still back
Yeah.
with what you were just
Yeah.
talking about around improv, because I think that's such a beautiful metaphor for life. We make plans. There's a saying out there,
Yep.
right? We make plans, God laughs.
Yes.
But
You're right.
truly, it's the truth. I mean, there is no plan beyond right now. I get that we have to plan financially and we
Yes.
plan for our
Right.
retirement and we do all the things. And then there's living and there's being in this moment and there's saying yes and, because we are constantly dealing with what comes next, moment
Yes.
to moment to moment,
Yep.
which is why I don't do canned interviews. I don't have any questions,
Yeah.
because it's the one time in my life I get to have a conversation and I don't have an agenda of where it needs
Yeah.
to go. It can go
Right.
wherever it needs to go. And so my question to you, what popped into my mind as you were, because you're playing out your life during this improv, right? It's your life.
Yeah.
Like, you don't know what's coming at you and you need to respond to it.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking about is, now you've had this child has been diagnosed with autism, and you're right. During that time, we still knew so little about it.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering how that played into you and your wife making a decision to have more children, that there
Mm.
had to have been fear
Oh
wrapped
yeah.
up in that decision to have more children. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah. It was, I look back at it. That's a really, really great question. Looking back at it, I was convinced that we probably shouldn't, because if we do, we're tempting that this will happen again. I mean, the early research was, if you had a child with autism, back in 2003, 2004, there was a strong chance that your next child would be impacted with something, but maybe even something that is even harder. I mean, or different. Like, it wasn't just autism you would be dealing with. You could deal, miscarriages, where the rates of that were higher, Down syndrome, all sorts of things that. And I didn't grow up. I was always afraid of, when I was a child, of people living with special needs. That's where the crazy irony in all this is. I remember in third grade, our teacher had a child who was impacted, I think, with Down syndrome. And their son would come in to kind of experience in our class, once or twice a week. And I was always so scared and afraid, because it showed just how fragile. I mean, even back then, I remember seeing, like, because she explained what it was and what had happened with a chromosome. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, how fragile everything is. And I didn't like to think about it. And I didn't like to see a physical manifestation of how fragile this whole ecosystem is, and how our bodies are, and how one just little degree one way and our whole life can change. And I remember it bothered me and scaring me. And her son was so wonderful. And by the end of the year, I was a little bit more comfortable around him, but I was always so nervous around people who were impacted with a special need. And I remember that was part of the work I had to deal with when I had my own son who was living with a special need, because I had my own shame of, like, oh, I can't believe, had I done a better job of immersing myself and getting to know people with special needs, I wouldn't have the stigma in my own mind. I was already worried about the stigma of other people had about my son. Even in a church, the idea we would bring him to church and people would ask us to go to the cry room because we would quit disturbing people in church. And that probably definitely affected my relationship with organized religion. But it was the idea of, like, I was already dealing with other people's expectations and stigma about our family, and I had my own to deal with. So it was a hard road for me to get past those things. And yeah, I can't remember your original question.
Well, you're getting to it. My question was the fear that must
Yeah, oh
have been
yes.
wrapped
Oh,
up in
for,
deciding to have more children.
so that was, my wife said this to me, and it's definitely in the yes and approach. She said, if we choose to live our life only expecting the worst, that's not living. That's just waiting for the next shoe to drop. And she's like, we can't live just waiting for something else bad to happen. And I grew up with a small family, just one older brother. All my extended family was from small family. My wife came from a big family, and she said, we need to give him a brother or a sister as a wingman. If something happens to us, we need someone who's going to be by his side as a family. And she's like, if you're worried about everything else, if you can't buy into the idea that, we can't live in fear, if you're still worried, think about having siblings that will always have his back. And we will create that environment for that to happen. And it worked out her plan. And I would hate to it. If she were here now, she would be smugly smiling at me from off camera, because she would never be on camera. She would be smugly smiling at me because she's been proven right. We had two more boys after that. Riley was born in 2004. No, 2002. I'm sorry. He was born just while Noah was getting diagnosed, but we knew something was going on right around there. So we had Riley then, and then we had Logan 4 years later in 2006. And they have become this kind of wolf pack. Noah's, not to jump ahead and spoil anything, but Noah's now in college. All these things that we were told about his life early on, by the time he was 12 and 13 and 14, it was a long, hard road. He worked his ass off to get to that moment. He struggled, he fought, we did all sorts of things to help him out, and he took advantage of everything. And we were so lucky and blessed that the way his autism affects him, he was able to find a way for it to still work in his life. And so he is now in college studying theater, which is hilarious, because I remember I always wanted to study theater when I was in college, but I was too afraid to tell my parents. And I remember when he told us he was going to be a theater major, I channeled my parents, and I automatically started thinking, it's like, well, how are you going to make a living with that? And then I remembered that's exactly what my parents would have said. So I stopped doing that. But he is in his third year in college. But one of the best things we did for him was to put other people in his life. We thought he might not ever be able to make friends, and making friends and relationships are tricky for him. He's the most loving, caring, open-hearted person I've ever met. Everyone in his world he ever meets is a good person. Even if they hurt him, there's a reason they hurt him, and he loves them still. He is the most open-hearted. His heart has no gate to it. It's come and go as you will. But without his brothers sitting next to him through this whole journey, I don't know that he would be where he's at now. All the things that we did, all the decisions we made, all the money we spent, all the 401ks we emptied out, all the things we did to help him on his journey, the best thing we ever did was give him some wolves to run with him in the pack. And so that, when you ask that question, I've never thought of it before. It's like, yeah, I was terrified. I imagine my wife on a lie detector would admit she was terrified, but we knew we needed more love in our family. And that's, I think, the decision we made.
I just want to say, though, I think that you gave your son the wolf pack, but I think the most important decision, I'm going to cry. I always end up crying during these interviews at some point because they touch me so deeply. But I think the most important decision that was made is the moment that you did not accept the limitations of your son that your doctor put on you, and you could have. And I say this often as a therapist, that our belief, the conversations that we have with ourselves are the most important ones we will ever have. And those are the beliefs that we carry forward. And I can tell you that you just as easily could have said, this is our fate. This is our son's fate. But that's not what you did. Instead, you took a different direction, and believing in your son and believing in possibility, that's the most important decision I think that was ever made, because that blazed a different trail for your son.
Yeah, it was the idea of, we were desperate. And that word often gets misused. Like, it's this desperation for us to be like, this can't be the story. The story can't be that we had this potential for this beautiful family, And all of a sudden, oh, this tragic thing happened. And now that's all the story will be from here on out is tragic. It would be, if God forbid I died in a car wreck today or my wife died in a car wreck today. I talked about this last week. I don't want it to be, oh, John Roedel died in a car wreck. I don't want that to be the story. That would be and that's what people will know me as. Oh, he died as a person who got in a terrible car wreck outside of town. It was a really bad wreck, and that's what I'm known for. I didn't want, in hindsight, looking at it, we were desperate. That was not going to be our story. No matter what our story would be, it wouldn't be, oh, everything was great. And then they had a child with autism and everything fell apart after that. That was not going to be our story.
And I think that when we are crawling around in our despair and desperation, I think that is where we find our strength, and I talk about that a lot in grief work, that the darkest tunnel I've ever walked is after my brother died, because of course I know young people can die, but people will always say, but I didn't know it was going to happen to me.
Right.
But what was particularly interesting is that, at that point I had written the dissertation on writing through grief and loss. I had done all the things, and here I was having to try to live that. And I think that, when you talk about desperation, I do think it's that dark point, which is where I would love to segue now, where you discover something much bigger and stronger inside of us and who we actually are at our core. And so can we segue into you went through your own dark period?
Yes. Yeah. So we went through the experience with our son with autism. And then at the same time, I was still living in Cheyenne, which was never what I wanted to do. I wanted to be Steve Martin. That was my hero growing up. That's who I wanted to be. And here I was in Cheyenne, but I found, okay, I've anchored myself to, okay, I'm not in Chicago. I'm not in New York. I'm not on TV. Get over it. But here I am teaching improv, performing, writing sketches. I have that to anchor to. Our family was growing. I was staying in town to help run our family store that had been open since the 1800s, 1880s. And then I had to close that store in 2007. It just became, the Walmarts of the world, a small mom and pop family drugstore. So I had to close that down. And that was part of the work I had to do. My dad had died 10 years earlier in 1997, 2007. We were closing the drugstore. My mom was older, but it was like my dad had died all over again. But I thought, okay, this is what I'm here for. I was here to help my dad's last few moments to journey on. I'm here to help our store kind of movie on. I feel like the guy in River Styx. That was my kind of thought. I'm here to help people close up shop. And then my mom died in 2011. And, all through that 14, 15-year span, I found this identity. I'm a dad living with a child with special needs. I'm helping him out. I'm teaching improv. I'm helping my mom. I'm helping the store. So we closed the store in 2007. My mom died in 2011. And so I still hung my hat on, okay, well, I'm a father of a child living with special needs who needs me all the time. I need to be available. My wife was working. That was my identity. It wasn't the identity I would have chosen for myself, but I found it's like when I would, when I bump into friends at reunions, be like, hey, what are you doing now? I would be a little bit ashamed, be like, well, I'm kind of a stay-at-home dad and I do improv on the weekends. It was I still felt weird about saying that. Here I was in my late 30s saying things like that, where people were lawyers and doctors and I was a stay-at-home dad, but I found value in that. And then after my mom died, about a year or two later, like out of nowhere, the chrysalis had broken open, the cocoon had unwinded, and Noah was flying. So lucky, so blessed. A lot of the work he did on his end, he didn't need me as much anymore. I wasn't having to go to school 2-3 times a day to help out. I wasn't having to make accommodations all day long to make sure he was taken care of. I wouldn't have to run him to 9 appointments after school. All of a sudden, he was much more independent. And about 2015, I was left with the idea, Noah was a sophomore and junior in high school. No, he had been a sophomore in high school. But at this point, it was becoming clear to me that his trajectory was he was going to fly away from this nest. And all of a sudden, I no longer had parents to take care of. I no longer had a store to help keep running. I no longer had a child who needed every waking second of my life. I didn't know who I was. And I had it was a perfect time for a midlife crisis, but it was like, I felt like my life hadn't even started. Here I was, I thought in 1996, I was going to be going off and having my adventures. It was now 2015, 2016, and I was still in the same place. And it hit me all at once. This idea of like, I didn't know who I was. I hadn't lived for myself. It was the perfect cliched midlife crisis. And in that moment, I recognized I hadn't been feeling well for a long time before that. These feelings of not feeling worthy, of self loathing, of these little veins were in the past had been passing moments. I'd had these experiences of really not liking myself, of not liking where I was, of being really mad and angry at myself. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just passing storms, it was a 40-day flood. I was overwhelmed by it. And thank God I had that practice of when my dad died and when Noah was diagnosed and when the store closed and when my mom died. I had this practice of writing little things to myself just to try to figure out, because I'd have these emotions, these crazy emotions that, I grew up in a household that where emotions were not currency. And so we didn't really talk about how we felt. And here I was having these emotions that I couldn't hide to myself. And I would go to therapists and they were, fine. And I felt like they were helped for a little bit. But then I felt like I was only saying things that the therapist wanted me to say in order to get through the hour so I could pay the copay and get out.
And that's like a little knife through my heart, because you're not, I've heard this so many different times. And so here you are, I feel like you're going through the motions. That's what it sounds like, doing the things, right? You're like, okay, well, the next step is probably to go to a therapist because maybe that'll help me. And that's not really helping me. And
check the box.
Check the box. What's going on in your marriage? Are you having these, my guess is you probably went to therapy because it was sort of another desperation thing, right?
Yes, it was that. Yeah. Yep. That's perfectly said. Yeah. Because I was trying to employ the same idea that we had for Noah. I got to be desperate to find my way out of this because it was a poison. And it was affecting how I was acting, and my wife, our marriage was fine, but it was only fine. It wasn't, we were best friends. We had met in 7th grade. And, she knew me. We were friends before we even started dating. And so friendship was the foundation. And I found myself, it was more of like a professional relationship at this point. Okay, I paid the bills, we did this. Like there was no friendship there because I was withholding, because I was afraid to tell her that there was something sinister going on inside of me. And I kept thinking this, and the word sinister kept coming to my mind. This is the feeling inside of me wasn't just, oh, I'm sad or I'm mad. I had these self-destructive feelings of, I would feel like my poor wife is stuck with me. This person who doesn't know who he is. She's got to be surrounded by all her friends, like her, their family is talking about their second timeshare or they're going to Cabo. And, and having a child with special needs definitely drained our bank accounts. We weren't living the Vanderbilt lifestyle. And I felt like I don't have a degree at this point. I dropped out of college. I had as I did, do I want to go back to college? And I didn't really feel, because I still like academics, and doing that was never really my thing. So I would just be doing that for somebody else, maybe to make my parents happy still. And so I just felt bad for my wife that she was stuck with me. It wasn't, I didn't resent her. I felt like I have served my purpose on this world. I was born to help my parents. I was born to help the store. I was born to help get Noah up and going. I was born to be a good father. But all those things, those roles, those identities were gone. They were fading away. I wasn't needed as much, and I couldn't find value in anything. And so it was affecting holistically, it was affecting my desire to do comedy. At this time, our shows were starting to wind up. We weren't able to do as much anymore. Cast members I was doing, they started having kids later in life, and they were kind of moving on from it. And so I was like, so I'm not even doing comedy anymore. And
so this is what we would call depression, right? You're in full-blown depression.
Full-blown.
And so my question is, in this, going back to this notion of despair, because depression it's very internal, right? Externalized, it can be like anger. Internalized, it really looks like this despair, like my poor wife is stuck with me. I think it's the perfect line, right? Because even this woman who loves you and has been with you your whole life, all of a sudden she's, so that is such a skewed perception of what's happening. Right. And so my question is, when you're feeling this way, and I asked you this prior to recording, did you ever want to take your life? And you had said that you didn't have a plan to die by suicide, but it would be okay if, a truck just sort of happened to swerve and run you over.
Right.
And I talk about that a lot with grief anyway, that you're not, people aren't actively suicidal. They simply just don't want to live in this body with all this pain anymore.
Right. Yeah, I felt like I was a spent firework. If you would find a firecracker on the ground that had already exploded, it's like, oh, we throw it out now. It did great. It served its purpose. But now, I mean, you can't relight a firework. I had felt I was a spent cartridge. There was nothing left for me to offer.
That is a super powerful image. That is one of the most powerful images I've actually.
Yeah, and that's how I always. No, I haven't. It's the idea of I had my shot and I took it. And, I wasn't looking back. Like at this point, I identified I had helped my parents. I had done all these things for people. But now I was at a point where, okay, what do you have to fall back on for yourself? And there was nothing. I didn't have an education. I didn't have any job prospects. We couldn't quite move because my wife had a wonderful job and we had dug deep roots in. Our children were still in school. We didn't want to uproot Noah from he was starting to bloom. We couldn't move somewhere else necessarily unless it was just for me. And so I felt trapped in my own body, in my own circumstance, but I was someone that didn't have anything left to give.
So put some context around this for us. How old is Noah at this point?
Probably 27, 16, about a sophomore in high school. So 15, probably he was older because 16.
And so you had your other two boys at this point.
Yeah. Right. 3 boys. And they're all very functional. They didn't need me by the time they were 4. Like they were very independent, very go-get-em kids that they didn't even need training wheels.
And how old are you? Sorry.
You're fine. No, how old would I be at this point? That'd be about 42, 43.
Truly midlife, right?
Yes,
so we always hear like
cliche. Yes.
Yeah, the cliche midlife crisis, but this sounds a little bit more, I'm going to use your word desperate to me. Like there's something big happening. What was, I always say there's a moment and people are like, well, sometimes Susan, there's not a moment. I'm like, okay. It's not sudden, right? Like nothing is sudden. We lead up to things, but what was the moment when you rediscovered your heart?
There is a moment, and I've never really thought about it like an exact, because it seems a little cliche, but so I remember feeling really, really sick, and I knew I was sick, and I felt the more I talked about it with people, the sicker I felt, because I'd been burying, like when I mentioned before, I had these experiences and these feelings before, even back, I could think back into college, having these moments of like, it wasn't just sadness, it was something more deeply rooted. The depression, I think I had since I was 18. I had experiencing bouts of depression since I was 18, but I didn't ever think about it. I'd always just buried it. So I was looking back and I remember being at one point, so angry because I didn't feel, at this point, I would go to Barnes & Noble. We had a Barnes & Noble in Cheyenne. I would go to Barnes & Noble every day because at this point, I was born and raised Catholic. I'd worked for a Catholic church for a while. Catholic was part of my identity for a good chunk of my life. At this point, it wasn't. It was another institution that had failed. It was another thing that I had clung to, religion, that it was not serving me anymore. I couldn't, like people would just say, pray, you'll feel better. Oh, if you pray to God and you didn't get your answer, it's probably because you're not praying the right way. Try this formulatic, algebra equation of these series of prayers, and then for sure it will happen. That wasn't happening. So I was angry at God and church and faith and all these things that I thought I had deposited in this bank account that I would be able to withdraw later in life when the poop hit the fan. And the poop was hitting the fan, and there was nothing that I would go to withdraw, and they would say, the bank's empty. Sorry, you don't have anything in here. So I was mad at religion. I was mad at myself. And I remember going to Barnes & Noble every day and trying to find any book I can, self-help, anything. I was reading it all. I was absorbing it all. And none of it connected with me. It was all, and not because they're bad writers, it was just because it didn't feel like it was written for me. Even I was getting into New Age law of attraction. Well, just think more positively and more positive things will come your way. That wasn't I tried that really hard for about 5 months. things like that were not working for me. And I was so frustrated and so angry. And I was thinking, how is this going to manifest? At some point, I was going to break. There was a movie growing up I remember called Falling Down with Michael Douglas about this working class man who one day just snaps. And he exerted his frustrations being violent to the world. I thought what's going to happen is I'm going to be violent to myself, or something is going to break inside of me, and I don't know what that's going to be. I'm going to do something away from my values. I was going to look for love in wrong places, whatever. I was going to become addicted to something. I knew something was going to happen. I was so angry because nothing was helping me. Therapy hadn't helped. So I sat down, and I was going to make fun of it all. I thought, well, I still like to make people laugh. So I started this little conversation to make fun of religion a little bit, make fun of self-help. And I had this series of conversations with God that I thought I would put on Facebook, Hey God, Hey John, in which I would have these little benign conversations with God, who I know I wasn't talking about with God. God wasn't on Facebook, but I was just going to be like, have these conversations with God about talking about, why faith isn't working for me, why prayer isn't working for me, why going and reading a Bible verse isn't going to save me from my depression. And I would have these benign conversations that started out funny at first because my goal was to kind of make people laugh and kind of be sarcastic about this whole self-help movement. And these conversations started with me and God having conversations about what was on TV, Big Brother the night before, Survivor, what other reality trash I was watching at the time. Or we would talk about making risotto or whatever it was. And then the one aha moment was, and my friends and family kind of follow along and they thought it was kind of cute and funny and a little snarky, which was great. It was the tenor I was going for. But one day I remember sitting there typing, and I typed out, and even in therapy, it had never been talked about. I'd never been identified. I wrote, I think it went, Hey God, Hey John. It was a typical format started. And then it was my turn to write again. And I wrote, I think I have depression. And that was the first, I'd never thought it. I'd never used that word. Because I don't know, I didn't want that to be the truth. So I remember typing it, and that was the first time I thought it, I registered, and it's right there flashing in front of me. And then God responded with something very easy, trite, but it doesn't matter. I still love you. And it was a whole conversation back and forth about it doesn't matter. I would write, okay, yeah, but this is how it feels. And I would write about what depression felt like: hopelessness, despair, worthlessness. It didn't matter. God would respond, it doesn't matter. I love you. And it was this whole conversation of self-love back and forth. And I got done with it. And I thought, I can't publish this. I can't post this on Facebook, because how will I be perceived by the world? How will anyone, I live in a small town. I bump into the same people every day. I live in the biggest town in Wyoming. It's about 60,000 at the time. It was probably close to 52,000. I can't be writing about things like this and be anonymous. And I struggled with it, but I felt this compulsion beyond me. And we talked about this real briefly beforehand. I still can't explain it. I don't think that I am this great metaphysical conduit to the great beyond. I don't have any self-inflated ego when it comes to this at all. But there was this compulsion to say, because, I developed a little bit of a following with these funny conversations. I thought, well, maybe this will help one other person. And then I will never, ever write like this again. I can't write like this again because it's humiliating. And I felt ashamed to see it all in front of me sprawled out. But I felt better writing it, but I didn't want to admit that at that point. So then I pressed post, publish, and then I wanted to go throw up for a while. And I shut my laptop, and I didn't want to look at it again, because I would only normally get like 1 or 2, 3 or 4 likes or something like that. When I came back to it about a half hour later, there's about 20, 30 likes, but I had received about 8 or 9 messages in my inbox from people saying, I'm going through the same thing right now. Thank you for talking about it. And half of them were men who, that not my normal, even at that point, not my normal audience. And they were saying things like, I'm feeling the same way. And I didn't know it. And I thank you for writing about it, because it helped me immensely. And it wasn't because I'm this great writer. I had come up with some great concept. I had not channeled Rumi.
It's because you had the courage to be vulnerable.
There's a vulnerability. You're exact. That's what I was at that moment of vulnerability where I took off the armor, took off the comedy, took off everything else, the worry about expectations of what people thought of me or what I thought about or what I wanted to think about other people thinking about me, all that BS that I walked around with, I took it off and I said, this is what's happening right now. And I wrapped it in love and I wrapped it in self kindness because those are the words I needed to read. Those are the words I couldn't find in those books. Those are the words I couldn't find sitting and listening for a sermon. Those are the words I couldn't find. I needed to write them for myself. And in doing that, it helped a couple other people out there. And from there on, it was a slow boil of me leaning into that kind of writing. It took a while to convince me that I wanted to be known for this. But it was more moments like that. But it was a great question you asked. What was the one moment? It was me finally writing that out and typing it out. And then having the audacity to say, other people need to see this. Because I felt audacious and a showboat, not a showboat, but oh, whoa, look at me. Here's a, cliche. I felt the cliched midlife. Oh, everyone's going to think, oh, just go buy a car and you'll feel better, midlife crisis boy. But no, I had this compulsion to say, this might help one other person. And so that's how it got started.
It's so powerful. So many things came to my mind. The first thought I had is, our shame can only live in our secrets, the things that we bury. That's where shame lives. That's how it festers. And then
Right.
I was, in what we bury rots, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it rots, it decomposes.
Yep.
And when we,
Yep.
and when we release, we expand. That's where beauty and love and our shadow side. I mean, to have self-love is to embrace all of who we are.
Yes.
We all have a shadow side. And to give language to that gives others permission, to not feel all alone, but to understand that those parts that we think are ugly are just as beautiful. They're what lead us to new awakenings. And more importantly, when we accept our shadow side, we accept it in someone else. That is compassion.
Yes. Empathy.
We cannot have compassion and empathy if we do not begin with ourselves. It is impossible. I want to talk to you for about a week, and we have 5 minutes to bring this to a close. I know, I can't believe it either. I always end with one question. And so what I'm going to do is ask you this last question. And then if you've got a 2 to 3 minute, do you have any beautiful piece of one of your writings that you can close us with? And also you can find all of John's information. His website will be all in the show notes. My last question to you after that incredible interview is, what does self-love look like for you now?
Patience. It's patience that to allow myself to heal. Even though that genesis of my writing and the way I write now is 6 years old, it's not like I am on top of this mountaintop talking down below to people who are, this is how I got up here. Come join me on top of the mountain. No, I am still hanging by the cliff face, writing about my experience in real time. I still have those moments of self-loathing, of hurt, of not healing as fast as I want to. And I get so impatient with myself. Why is this wound not a scar yet? Why is this scar not disappeared yet? Why is it not going faster? Why am I not in a different place? But the more patient I am with myself, it's like watching a flower. It's just sitting there. And when you talk about what we bury, rots, thank God for me, the thing I buried somehow got attached to a seed, but all these things I had put inside of me, an acorn maybe, and an acorn started coming up with it. And it was able for me to look at all this stuff I had buried and to deal with it. But the acorn was this idea of writing. And it's the idea of be patient with yourself. Don't rush through your wounds just to make other people feel better. Don't rush through your grieving to make other people less uncomfortable. Let it take its time and be patient with yourself as you do, because it's not a race. It is a slow, it's like maple syrup dripping out of, it's all worth it, but it's going to take a while to get out of the jar to get onto your pancakes. Let it happen. Be patient with yourself. And so that's what I tell myself. Even today, I was frustrated with something. It's like, this should be happening right now for my life. Why don't I write about these things? Why don't I feel better? And then take a breath, live in the moment. Don't let yesterday bother you. Don't live in your heart too much. Don't live in your head too much. Stay in the moment and be grateful for right now. I'm still alive. I didn't give in to despair. And be patient with yourself because eventually it will bloom. So it's amazing that you brought that up. So this is a poem that I wrote myself in my darkest moments when I really wanted that brain aneurysm, that truck to hit me, a piece of space debris to come out of the sky, like a toilet from a defunct space station to come down and crash onto me. This is a poem I wrote myself to keep myself alive. Oh, my troubled lovely, oh, my weeping daisy, oh, my fading candle, oh, my broken beauty, oh, my crumbling stronghold. Stay with us here on this earth. Don't rapture yourself. We need you. Before you decide to leave, sit with me here in your unmade self at the edge of this unmade bed and listen to me tell you one last secret. Oh, my tearful songbird, if you can find a way to survive long enough, someday you'll become the answer to somebody else's most desperate prayer by just being there in the same room that they're in as they gently fall apart. And in that moment, you won't need to say anything. You'll just need to drape your hands over theirs like a Good Friday altar cloth until they believe in resurrection again. That's why you can't give up. Your life will someday be the rainbow at the end of someone else's storm. If you aren't still here when they fall off the bridge, who will be there to catch them? I know it's not quite fair, but this life isn't just yours. It also belongs to the person who's going to need you to be alive later on. You're part of the community of unintended angels who has a sacred calling of surviving your darkest night so someday you can be the sunrise for someone else who will need you to prove that the daybreak always returns. Oh, my clouding diamond. Oh, my shaking sunflower. Oh, my doubting saint. Oh, my quieting symphony. Stay with us here on this earth, because if you do, you will save a dozen lives by first saving your own. It's the great pyramid scheme of hope. You must persist so they can watch how you persist. Turn this riptide you are drowning under into a ripple of hope that stretches through time, that you can ride until you reach that one moment in your life where you will find yourself in a quiet room with somebody who also wants to become a shadow. And then you're going to be able to say to them with the authority, the same thing that I'm saying to you right now. Oh, my troubled lovely. Oh, my weeping daisy, oh, my fading candle, oh, my broken beauty, oh, my crumbling stronghold. Stay with us here on this earth. Don't rapture yourself. We need you.
John, thank you so much. I am speechless. That was such a beautiful way to end this very powerful interview together. I want to thank all of my listeners. There are so many gems. I hope you tuck them away in your pocket and pull them out when you need some hope to hang on to. Please look for John's work. It is so powerful. And thank you all, and we'll see you here next week. Bye for now.